Hi everyone, my name is Joe and thank you for tuning into What Does That Piece Do? This is a video series where I explore history through analog games, and today I'm going to take you through Cuba Libre. So this is game number 2 in the Coin series. It was designed by Grossman and Volko Ruhnke, released on GMT Games in 2013. The Coin series is counter-insurgency games, so conflict simulators where you've got multiple factions all vying for different ideas of victory here. So it's a really great system to learn, and this is a great entrant way into it. So there's about 10 different games and counting as of this recording right now. So learning this game is a really great way for you to learn an entire system that unlocks other games for you to play down the road too. My goal today is to teach you this game as quickly and efficiently as possible, and also teach some history along the way. And I've got a little segment called This Piece Changes History, where I focus on a very particular piece of the game. Now, I know there's quite a few other videos out there about this game, but some of them can be pretty long. Some of them are entire playthroughs that are like hours long. I've got my teach down to about 45 minutes, so if you did want to jump to that right away because you just came to learn the game, or someone sent you this video, say, hey, you should check this out because I want to play this with you, you got the timestamps below, you can get right to it, because I'm going to touch on a little bit of history first. But some of those other videos are really great to watch if you've got the time, namely the Watch It Played, How to Play guys, Rodney and Matthew. They go through the entire playbook here, which basically it's a step-by-step guide that takes you through a quarter of the game. If you had the right people around you, if you had 3 others that wanted to really learn this game, this is a great way to learn. You know, I really recommend doing it. But otherwise, if you want something quick and efficient, that's what I set to do today. By the way, I want to give a shout out right now to Rodney from How to Play team. He lives in a part of Canada that was just hit really hard by Hurricane Fiona. Recovering from that, he's okay, but I guess he's lost power for now, so he's kind of out of loop for a little bit. Meanwhile, the island of Cuba itself is recovering from Hurricane Ian. So, and that also hit some of the southern states. So, either in the entire island of Cuba was without power for a bit. As of right now, I think they're still recovering from that. So, really, thinking about all those folks, you guys are in my thoughts right now. I hope you can all recover and get back to a normal life sometime soon. So, thinking about you, hang in there. So, let's set the context here for the Cuban Revolution. In 1950s Cuba, it wasn't really a great place for, well, Cubans. In fact, as much as 75% of the land at this point has been owned by foreign interests. Havana, the capital, it had pretty much become a playground for rich foreigners. It was a major tourist destination with casinos primarily run by the American mafia, which was making big cash. But meanwhile, regular Cubans were fighting for scraps. You know, some locals were getting work in casinos, but those jobs were few and far between, and it would potentially get you mixed up with organized crime. More on that in a little bit, though. There was overall a big American presence in Cuba at this point, one that had been established as far back as the 1800s, when the first Cuban Revolution took place, when the island shed the chains of Spanish colonial rule. With a marginal amount of help from the Americans at the time, if anything, the American presence, it hindered some of the local rebels' efforts at the time. But that didn't really stop the American military back then for claiming some undue credit and establishing today what is Guantanamo Bay, where there are still U.S. military bases. Anyway, back to the 50s, you've essentially got a military dictator in charge by the name of Fulgencio Batista. He sat as president back in the 40s. He went to live in the U.S. for a while and invested in real estate even for a bit. But he came back and his regime took power by a coup in the early 50s. This was supposed to be, a man of the people. He grew up poor before joining the army and rising to the ranks to the top spot in power. But he was essentially in the pocket of the American mafioso, mainly Meyer Lansky, the man that basically built the casino and tourism scene in Cuba. All of this was about to change, though. Student uprisings were taking place across the country. This was in response to Batista's disruption of legitimate elections that had taken place before he had seized power. So there's the centrist movement, which would become known as the Directorio. It really lacked any solid leadership that would give their specific movement the strength and the momentum to upset Batista. Meanwhile, an upstart revolutionary by the name of Fidel Castro began kicking up a fuss in opposition to the military dictatorship as well. In the summer of 53, Fidel, along with his brother Raul, they attempted to take over the Moncada army barracks near Santiago de Cuba, but that was thwarted. Fidel was arrested. But then he was later released by Batista, when then he was exiled to Mexico, where he met another up-and-coming revolutionary, a pharmacist by the name of Che Guevara. Together, they'd lead the socialist July 26 movement. They were named after the date of the Moncada attacks, and they'd rally guerrillas across the country with their bases mainly in the Sierra Madre Mountains in the east of the island. By the late 50s, the Cuban government, the July 26 movement, the Directorio, and even the mafia syndicate in Cuba, they had lots to gain or lose in the restless nation, what was going to take place over the next couple of years. So Cuba Libre is a battle between these four factions, right? You've got the government representing Batista's ruling party, also known as the counterinsurgency faction. You've got the July 26 movement. That represents Castro and his guerrillas. The Directorio, which is the moderate faction trying to wrestle power from Batista but not letting Castro and his movement take over. Both of those factions are known as the insurgents factions. And finally, we have the syndicate, which represents the mafia that controls the casinos and makes fat stacks of cash from all forms of tourism. The government is going to be trying to maintain power. Their victory is tied to the total support across the whole map. July 26th is trying to destabilize the government, so their victory comes from opposition, which, as you can imagine, is the polar opposite to support, plus the number of their bases that are actually on the map. Directorio is aiming for just overall presence, which is enough control over enough map spaces as well as their established bases on the map. And the syndicate can win from having enough open casinos and cash overall. So now you've got the background. So let's hit the board, let's hit those cards, let's go. Or as they say in Cuba, vámonos. Each faction has a unique set of actions they can perform, or they may choose to activate an event from the events cards in the deck that controls the flow of the game. Players don't take these cards into their hand. They're always exposed and they drive the game. There are some cards that the government player may take for a few rounds, but those are always face up for all to see. More on that later. The cards also tells us who gets to play first on each card. There are a total of 4 propaganda cards spread throughout the deck, which will cause the game to pause, check and see if any player has met their victory conditions, and if not, then every faction can shore up resources and potentially take a few actions before a reset takes place, and then you proceed with play, drawing more events cards until the next propaganda card comes up. I'll get into events and propaganda cards in a bit. I just mentioned this here to point out that the game isn't over as soon as a player meets the threshold for their specific victory condition. The game can only possibly end when a propaganda card is revealed and a player has reached that victory condition. You'll see shortly how support, opposition, control, and established bases and open casinos are represented and affected on the map of Cuba Libre. But for now, know that all 4 of those things are tracked along the top of the board, among other things like the number of resources each faction has with these round cylinders. Note also that the factions are aiming for different quantitative levels of their specific victory condition. So government is aiming for a support level of 19 and for all cities to be at active support. July 26 needs opposition plus the number of their bases on the map to total 16 or more to win. Directorio needs the population of their controlled spaces plus the number of their bases on the map to be 10 or more, and Syndicate needs to have at least 8 open casinos plus their resources need to exceed 30. Each faction has a certain number and type of pieces that are placed and moved around on the map that will help them achieve their victory conditions and thwart the other players from reaching theirs. Government has cubes which represent troops and police, and these discs are government bases. There's just 2 of those. These pieces all serve different roles to maintain order. Police will mostly stick to the cities and by the bases, and troops are effective in exposing and removing the insurgent guerrillas in the provinces, and bases help keep these troops embedded in the countryside. July 26 and Directorio have the guerrillas, which are these hex cylinders and a bunch of bases. You notice the guerrillas have a blank side, which is the underground side, thus they're hidden to government troops. And the active side has their respective symbols, which means they're exposed to troops' activities. Guerrillas become active throughout play, and in some cases, these factions will need underground guerrillas to even execute certain actions. The Syndicate has just a handful of guerrillas as well, with both underground and active sides. But in certain situations, they'll be able to make use of the government cubes, including moving them around on the map. Most of the Syndicate pieces are the casinos, and unlike the other factions' bases, they're two-sided, with a blank side, which represents closed, and the symbol side means an open casino. All of these wooden bits are pieces, which is important to call out, as some of the events and actions that can be taken by the players may make reference to pieces, which includes the bits representing people, bases, and casinos, but otherwise the instructions should specify to say cubes, meaning any government piece if not specifically naming police or troops, or guerrillas, meaning any type of guerrilla from the various factions. As mentioned, all pieces are meant to be placed on the map, and if they're not on the map, then they're in the respective players' available boxes. The map of Cuba has specific areas for cities and provinces. Provinces have different terrain types that may affect how some actions play out. Cities and provinces have boxes where overall support, opposition, and control is marked as it shifts back and forth. And these three spaces, which are economic centers, they're specifically for the government player to gather more resources during the propaganda rounds that you'll learn more about soon. All cities and provinces have a population number. Those are multipliers for control, support, and opposition that contribute to the faction's victory conditions. Economic centers, often referred to ECs in the game, have an econ value. Let's first talk about control. Certain actions and Directorio's overall victory condition are determined by individual controls of the cities and provinces on the map. Control is determined by the faction that has the most pieces total in the space that's greater than the combined other pieces from the other factions in that same space. An empty space is therefore uncontrolled. But let's say this lone July 26 guerrilla moved into Camagüey province. Now it's under July 26 control. If a single Directorio guerrilla moved into that space, it would be uncontrolled again, because the two cancel each other out. But if two Directorios came in, then the Directorio would have control. But if there was a July 26 base already there, before those Directorios came in, then that's two for both sides, so again, uncontrolled. Now let's say 5 government troops come flying in, and now the space is under government control, because that 5 is more than the 4 already there from the other 2 factions. All pieces then, bases included, count for control. The only exception is the Syndicate's casinos. Those need to be opened to count for control. So here's a lone Syndicate guerrilla, a closed casino, and a lone Directorio guerrilla. The space is uncontrolled since it's 1 for 1, but if that casino opens, then now it's under Syndicate control. As mentioned, certain actions may require control of the space, which is just simply, is it controlled or not? But Directorio scores overall points for the total population controlled by that faction across the entire map, along with the number of their bases on the map. They start the game with 1 guerrilla in Camagüey, and no other pieces, so they have control of that space. And only that space at the start, so their score to start things off is 1. If Directorio takes control of another space with population 1, their victory marker goes up 1 space. If it's a population 2, then it'll go up 2 spaces. Likewise, it'll move down if control is taken away, either neutralized to the uncontrolled, or another faction moves in enough pieces in, or eliminates the Directorial pieces for that faction to then take control. It's really important to do this as you go. Mark things along the top track, but at any point you just might want to stop and tally up and verify the control spaces on the map to make sure that the track is accurate. Note that all cities and provinces have the same stacking limit, which is a maximum of 2 non-casino bases in a space, as well as a maximum of 2 casinos. However, there is just one event that allows to break that rule, and it says ignore stacking limit right on it. So control is pretty straightforward. Now let's talk about support and opposition. The box next to the indicator that shows control of the region tells us the support or opposition level in that province or city, both of which can be passive or active. Remember, government wants support, but the July 26 movement wants opposition. So say in Latvia, with a population of 2, that was set to passive support. Well, that counts as a total of 2 support, which favors the government. If it's moved up to active support by a government action or some sort of event, then that's a total of 4 support from that province alone, tracked with a marker along the track. July 26 is going to try to shift that in the other direction towards opposition. Each shift counts as one step from active support to passive support to neutral, so no points for either the government or July 26th. Then to passive opposition, so now it's starting to count 2 opposition total for July 26th. And then active opposition, in this case, the 2 population times 2, so 4 opposition points total for the July 26th victory condition. Those 2 opposing factions count their points from overall support or control across the entire map, all cities and provinces tallied together, and using the population as a multiplier. Basically, anytime support or opposition shifts up or down, even to neutral, either the government or the July 26 player's score will change. Each faction will need to spend these generic resources to conduct most of their actions. July 26 and Directorio's actions all cost 1 resource per space wherever the action takes place, so they can spend multiple resources in one turn. Most of the syndicates cost 1 resource as well, but there's some more expensive actions like building and opening casinos. That costs 5, and the bribing special activity costs 3. Syndicate is the only faction that has their victory conditions tied to how many resources they have when there's a victory check, essentially representing cash for that faction. The government's action costs are variable. It's either 2, 3, or 4 per action per space, and that's determined by the US aid marker. This starts the game at 2, so actions start cheaper for the government, but as you'll see, that aid starts to fall off and things get more expensive for the government. All factions have actions that allow them to recoup and collect resources, and more can be collected based on the board state during the propaganda rounds. And players can even pass when it's their turn. They'll gain 3 resources when the government player passes, or 1 resource for any other player faction that passes on their turn. Okay, so now we've figured out what these pieces do and what support control is on the board, but now what do you do with that information? Well, every faction is going to have an opportunity to perform operations and special activities. They're all outlined in this special player aid, which shows all the different factions, all the things that they can do. Everyone gets a copy of one of these. What you have here is the operations that you're going to be able to take more often than not. Sometimes it'll be paired with special activities. Now, when you're selecting an operation, you're only doing one type of operation, and you could be doing it in multiple spaces, but only once per space on that turn. Like I say, sometimes you could pair it with the special activities. There's certain conditions of what can happen where, how much it costs, what the outcome is, depending upon the scenario or even the terrain. So just read that fine print here very carefully. I'm going to cover these pretty quickly just so you know what they do and kind of what you're going to be doing on the board. But again, you're always going to have this by your side when you're playing the game, and you'll have a copy that has every player's, every faction's operations and special activities, even along with the victory conditions, so you can keep track of who's doing what, so you know what may be coming next. But let's take a look at those now. The first operation you'll notice is Rally. This is how the insurgents get more of their pieces on the board. The game starts with some out there, but players will want to start dumping guerrillas onto the island of Cuba to get the job done. So the cost of 1 resource per space, July 26 can select any spaces without support, so they can either be at neutral or any level of opposition. Likewise, Directorio can select spaces that are neutral or either passive support or opposition. Remember, they're more centrist. They can't go into the extreme territories that are at active support or active opposition. Either side may place 1 guerrilla, or replace 2 guerrillas with a base, moving those replaced guerrillas back into their available forces pool. Or, if there's already a base there, July 26 can place twice the population plus twice the number of bases, whereas Directorial can place guerrillas equal to the population plus the number of bases in that space. Another option, if there is a base, either side could flip any active guerrillas they have there to underground, thus hiding them from government forces or getting them ready for another action you'll learn about shortly. Just remember you can only do one of these things once in any given space on a turn. There's no adding guerrillas, and if you have the resources, removing those guerrillas to place a base in that same space. I'll pause here to mention that any guerrillas and any pieces at all need to come from the player's available pool first. If all the pieces of that type are already deployed, they may treat any pieces on the board as available, thus moving them from one map space to another. The next operation to highlight for the insurgents is March, which allows the insurgents to move guerrillas from one space to an adjacent space. Each destination space will cost 1 resource, except these economic centers, which don't cost anything. However, if either July 26 or Directorio moves spaces into a space with any level of support, or if its space is an economic center, and the total guerrillas moving plus a number of cubes in that space already, if that number exceeds 3, then all the guerrillas are activated. Basically, you're rolling in deep, and the collective presence of cubes, police, and troops in that space means your guerrillas are spotted. So let's take a look at these options. July 26 can march these 2 guerrillas into Las Villas from Matanzas with 3 troops, but there's no support, so they're okay. But if it was 2 troops and passive support there, those guerrillas are exposed because that's exceeding the 3 pieces. They could instead march 2 guerrillas into La Habana province and bring in these other 2 from Havana City without flipping active, and there's no cubes there. It would only cost 1 resource because that's just 1 destination. Okay, here's where things get ugly. At some point, the insurgents are going to want to start removing the other faction's pieces to gain control of a space or just get them out of the mix. July 26 and Directorio can attack any other faction, including each other, for 1 resource per location. In that location or locations, all the guerrillas are set to their active side if they're not already. It doesn't mean there needs to be any underground guerrillas present at the space to begin with. They're just all going to be active at the end of this turn. The player rolls their single colored die, and if the roll is equal to or less than the number of guerrilla pieces, they remove 2 of the targeted faction's pieces. But it's always cubes and guerrillas before the bases. The government cubes will protect any casinos. So if the player rolls a 1, they'll get to place 1 of their guerrillas in that space as well. Oh, and if one of the targeted pieces has cash, the attackers can take that. Those will be explained with the syndicate's operations in a little bit. And now things get uglier as the insurgents start to sow terror across Cuba. Again, 1 resource for each space. Unless it's an economic center, then no cost, but it will require at least 1 underground guerrilla. That guerrilla gets flipped to active, a terror marker gets placed in the city or province, and then July 26 can shift the support opposition 1 level towards active opposition. Directorio, when taking the operation, will shift once towards neutral. Again, this is their way of controlling the game and taking away support from the Gov or opposition from the July 26th movement without pushing it into the other direction. If terror happens in an economic center, then a sabotage marker is placed there. You'll see why that's important shortly. So those are the 2 factions operations, and sometimes they'll even be able to pair 1 operation, which may take place in multiple spaces, with 1 special activity in just 1 space. Note that only certain pairings can happen. For July 26th, they can match Rally or March with Infiltrate, which allows them to swap out a government cube with 1 of their own. Attack can be paired with Ambush, which guarantees success in the attack location without having to even roll the die. That will only activate 1 underground guerrilla, and they'll be able to place another guerrilla, along with removing 2 of the target pieces. And terror can be combined with kidnap, which allows a transfer of a die roll and resources from the syndicate if it's a space with a casino, or from the government if it's a city. But guerrillas have to exceed police in that space to get away with that. Directorial may pair rally and march with subvert, which is a way of collecting resources equal to the population of the province where the special activity takes place. And also, we get to set the province's space to neutral. Attack, like July 26, can be paired with ambush to ensure the victory without even rolling to die. And with terror, they can assassinate to remove one more enemy piece. I covered all those pretty quickly, so just be sure to check the location conditions and what can be paired with what in the action menu. So that's the chaos that the insurgents can cause. Let's take a look at those counterinsurgent operations that the government can execute. Like the rally function for the insurgents, train is how to get more government cubes on the board. For the costs as determined by US aid level, the Gov can place up to 4 police or troops in any cities or in provinces that have a government base. You can do it in as many spaces as you can afford, and then replace 2 cubes with a base in any one space. Or, if a space has police, troops, and government control, they can buy a civic action. That would shift one step towards active support in the space. Or if there's a terror marker, it would remove the terror. So think of terror as a shield against shifting support or opposition. Basically, the people in this region have the fear in them, and they aren't going to change their minds about who they support without a little extra help. There's no reason there should be that much terror on anyone's space on the board at any given time. If you have that much terror, you're doing it wrong. It's too much terror. And it's not called out on the action menu. It's mentioned in the rulebook as part of the propaganda round. But civic action always costs 4 resources for the government. Garrison is an operation that will help the government re-secure those economic centers. Per US alliance, pay the cost to move any cubes to any economic centers or cities. And for each cube moving into that space, that will activate 1 guerrilla that's already in that space. On top of that, the government will be allowed to conduct 1 assault in an economic center, which is removing 1 active guerrilla for every troop now in the space. Remember, the government's going to want to start getting guerrillas out of there. They don't want to be outnumbered when the propaganda round comes around. Sweep is the operation that will expose the guerrillas. For each space, pay the cost as per US alliance. Then the government can bring in troops from adjacent spaces. Then for every cube in that space, activate 1 guerrilla. Unless it's a force, then activate 1 for every 2 cubes. Bringing in troops from an adjacent space isn't necessary to execute the operation, but you can do that if you need to. Otherwise, just sweep in place. Guerrillas that are activated can now be from any faction. You can even activate a mix of guerrillas. They're now going to be exposed and subject to the final operation, which is assault. Once again, paying the costs per the US alliance, government can assault, which removes 1 active guerrilla for every troop cube present in the provinces, and even bases if all those factions' guerrillas are now being removed. If it's a mountain province, then it's 1 guerrilla being removed for every 2 troops. Or in a city or economic center, it's 1 for every cube, so this time including police. Like the insurgents, the government may now have the opportunity to pair an operation with a special activity. Those include transport, which is moving 3 troops from a city or a base to any one space. That's the only special activity that can be paired with just train. All our other operations can be paired with any special activity. Airstrike will take out an active guerrilla or a base if there's no guerrillas left in that province or economic center. This activity is not available if the US alliance is on the bottom space. And finally, reprisal will allow the government to shift a government-controlled space towards neutral, but not towards support, and relocate a guerrilla from that space to an adjacent space. But it'll add a terror marker to that space. That was another whirlwind tour of special activities, so make sure you read the fine print in the actions menu. Looking at Syndicate now, they're technically insurgents as well and share some similarities with July 26 and Directorio. But there's a big departure in some of the operations because, well, they're all about the money and opening those money machines, the casinos. Syndicate can rally similar to the others, but there's no basis to multiply the number of guerrillas placed. There's only 6 guerrillas total for this faction in the whole game. But rally can happen anywhere for Syndicate, no restrictions on support or opposition's levels. And open casinos do allow to flip guerrillas underground rather than placing new ones. March is also similar, right down to flipping the guerrillas active if the space they're moving into has cubes and the total number of marching guerrillas plus cubes exceeds 3 in that destination space. Construct is an operation that is unique to the Syndicate. It's the only one that costs 5 resources to either place a closed casino or open a closed one. Since you can only do this once in any space on any given turn, you'll be placing a closed one on one turn and then potentially opening it on a later turn. Once on the map, closed casinos cannot be removed by an attack or an assault, but open ones can be closed. And remember the stacking rule. At most 2 casinos can be placed in any one province or city, with the only one exception from a specific event card. End Terror is once again similar to the other insurgents factions, most in common with the Directorio. Doing so and paying 1 resource per space adds a terror marker and shifts opposition or support 1 step towards neutral. Like the Directorio, they're trying to stop the Gov or July 26 from getting too close to victory. Or, again, if they're in an economic center, then that place gets a sabotage. The Syndicate special activities are quite unique to this faction as well. Profit is how these cash tokens interplay. In up to 2 spaces with open casinos, Syndicate can place one of these with their guerrilla or with a government cube. These are good for a single limited operation. So that's an op in just one space during a player's turn where they're only executing operations and not special activities. Or if held into the propaganda phase, that piece can be used to place a base, a casino, depending upon who's holding it, or open a closed casino, or be traded for 6 extra resources. The other option with profit is to close an open casino and trade in any cash in that space for 3 resources. Muscle is the special activity that can be used to move troops or police to open casinos to provide protection, or to even move troops to economic centers. And finally, bribe is the Syndicate's way to pay other factions to just, well, go away. Pay 3 resources and remove government cubes, remove or flip guerrillas, or even remove another faction's base. Now that we understand the pieces, the map, what the pieces can do on the map, let's see how the game is played. First, set up the pieces on the board as indicated by the board. There's these handy symbols showing exactly what goes where as far as pieces, and also the control, support, and opposition levels in each space. This is also in the rulebook, along with the starting resources and victory condition levels for each faction. But take a minute to read the board when all the pieces are in place, and make sure you understand why each space has control marked the way it is, and to add up the support, opposition, control, bases, and casinos to see how they add up to those victory tokens on the track. Does the math all make sense to you? If not, maybe you better jump back a few minutes in the video to make sure you understand, or dive into the rulebook for clarity. But otherwise, if you're good, let's proceed. Place the US Alliance level at 2, and this special aid marker on the victory resource track at 15. This affects the government player and will make more sense in the propaganda round. Place all the player pawns in the eligible side of the sequence of play box. And now set up the events deck. Shuffle all the event cards together, then break them into 4 separate piles with equal numbers of cards. Place a propaganda card in each, shuffle each, then stack them to make your events deck. The idea here is to evenly spread the propaganda cards throughout the 4 different piles of the deck. Well, at least that's what the rulebook says to do. I actually prefer to make 8 equal piles and put the propaganda in every second deck. This just ensures there's a bunch of event cards to play between each propaganda round. There's a bit of debate on this in the coin circles. Some folks love the chaos of prop cards coming up within a few cards of each other, but having played a game where the final and decisive propaganda card came up within 2 cards of the last one, I found it to be a bit of a downer. Either way, now you have your events deck set up, so reveal the top card and place it next to the event deck, and then reveal the next card and just place it on top of the events draw pile. You'll be looking at the first card that's off the deck, but all players will know what's coming next, which is part of the thrill of the game. Across the top of the event card are symbols that show the sequence of who gets to play first. Follow that from left to right. On the event itself is text that can be executed by the faction that is taking the event. Unshaded text tends to favor the insurgent factions, but the shaded text tends to favor the government. But to understand who gets to take advantage of that event, we need to understand the sequence of play box. This sequence of play box dictates the flow and who gets to do what. As all factions begin as eligible, the first player of the game is a faction noted in the top left of the event card. So that player gets to take any of the boxes just to the right of the eligible box that says first faction on them. So those options are operation only. So the faction can execute any of those operations on the left side of the player aid. They can execute in as many spaces as they're eligible to perform that operation and that they can afford, but they won't be doing any special activities. That means the second faction that follows them will only be able to do a limited operation, which is just one operation in only one space, no matter how they can afford, no special activities. The first faction may opt to do an operation in multiple spaces with a special activity. If they do so, the second faction that acts can do a limited operation, again, just in one space, no special activity, or they can trigger the event. And the final box at the bottom means the first faction will be the one to trigger the event. But if they do, that means the second faction to act will get to perform an operation in multiple spaces if possible, and a special activity to go with it. The final option is simply to pass and collect the resources. So that'll be 3 for the government player, 1 for all other factions. So let's look at an example here. In this case, government is the first eligible player as per the card. They don't have much use for the event, but they also don't want July 26th to take advantage of the event. So the government elects to do operations only, so that July 26th is stuck with just a single limited operation in just one space. But now, because the government player did that, July 26th decided they'd wait for the next card since they're the first eligible on that card. So July 26th passes for 1 resource. Syndicate will then be eligible, so they figure, why not? Let's just do a simple limited operation and probably place a casino to get the ball rolling. Because that second space is filled, that card is done and we move on to the next card. Slide government and syndicate pawns over to the ineligible space since they got to execute operations. Take the revealed card off the top of the deck, slide it over to the active event pile, and reveal the next card on top of the event draw deck. And now July 26th is eligible again since they passed, and Directorial will have the opportunity to follow July 26th. On this next card, July 26th will take the event, thus leaving Directorio the opportunity to execute some of their operations in as many spaces as they can and also execute a special activity. They can of course pass for 1 resource, but it's good to take the operation special activity combo when possible, especially if you have the resources. If they both take a spot on the sequence of play rather than passing, then they'll both be ineligible for the next card, and government and syndicate will then be shifted over to eligible. Some event cards will say government momentum on them. If the government player is able to trigger these events, they don't do anything right away, but will offer some bonus capabilities when executing operations until the next propaganda card. They claim those cards and keep by their play area, but not until at the end of the turn when the use of that card is done, just to keep track of the turn order. There's also these capability cards for any insurgent factions. If those are triggered by the corresponding faction, they get those capabilities for the rest of the game. There's tokens to indicate that those capabilities are active, And they describe the capability as best as they can on such a small space, but if you need to hold onto the card to remind you of their unique power, feel free to do so, again, after play on that card is done. Play continues on this way until a propaganda card becomes the active event. So that propaganda card may be revealed on the top of the deck so players know it's coming, but only eligible factions for the current card will be able to take advantage, make any final moves, and jockey for position as they head into the propaganda round. When the propaganda card becomes the active event, just keep it on the top of the deck while you resolve the round. No one gets to see the next event card coming in order to affect some decisions that may be made during this round. Now, go through these phases. There's actually a little marker to keep track of which steps you're at, but there's a lot to remember, so you'll want to reference the rulebook or one of these other handy player aids along the way. Anyway, here are the steps. Check for victory. Did any of the players reach their victory conditions? If so, the game over and congrats to the winner. If not, proceed to the next phase, which is the resources phase. First off, any economic centers that have July 26 or directorial guerrillas that outnumber government cubes, place a sabotage marker. That might just take one guerrilla for that to happen. Any ECs that are already sabotaged, leave them there. And now the government player will collect resources equal to the number of unsabotaged economic centers, plus the US aid, which is the marker on the track, which, if you recall, at the beginning of the game starts at 15. The July 26 gets resources equal to the number of bases they have on the map. Directorial gets resources equal to the number of spaces where they have pieces on the map. And Syndicate gets resources equal to the population of each city and econ value of each EC, whereas guerrillas outnumber the police. Plus, they'll get twice the number of open casinos in resources. But then the skim happens. So for each space with an open casino that's controlled by another faction, the Syndicate has to fork over 2 resources to that controlling faction. There's an event, a Syndicate capability that blocks this, by the way, but that's another way that some of these other factions can collect resources beyond the base way that they collect resources. Now, any factions that's controlling any cash, that token is stored under one of their pieces on the board. They can trade that in for a base or open a casino for the Syndicate, or trade that in for 6 more resources. Great. Now everyone is shored up on resources. Next is the support phase. Check to see that the government's total support, if it's at 18 or less, the US alliance shifts down 1 box, and aid thus drops by 10 on the track. So if it was firm, where operations for the government cost only 2 resources, now it's at reluctant, and operations will cost 3 resources. If it gets embargoed, operations will cost 4, and they'll no longer have access to the airstrike special activity. As total support of 18 is nearly the victory condition for the Gov, you can imagine they'll have a pretty hard time keeping the alliance and aid up, but there's some events to help the government in this respect if they can take advantage of them. And now the government gets to perform one of those civic actions that we mentioned as a potential thing that they can do during the train operation. Well, now they can do as many as they want. For 4 resources in government-controlled cities and provinces that have both police and troops, they can remove terror, and once there's no terror, shift 1 space towards active support in that space. So say there's a space at passive opposition with 1 terror. That would then cost 4 resources to remove the terror, 4 to shift towards neutral, 4 more to shift to passive support, then 4 more to shift to active support. Total of 16 resources to do that. Once the government is done taking advantage of civic action, then the July 26th may do agitation, which is basically the opposite of civic action, only costing 1 resource for July 26th. In a space they control, they can first remove terror, then shift towards active opposition, spending as many resources as they want to do so in as many spaces as they want. Note that terror doesn't need to exist in spaces to do civic actions or agitation. It's just an extra layer before support opposition starts to shift. Then once all the agitation is done, directorial gets expat backing, which is a free rally action in 1 space that has neither active support or active opposition, so it can be passive or neutral. and that no other faction controls, it can be a space that is uncontrolled. At this point, if this was the final propaganda card, then that would be the game end, but otherwise, proceed with the last two phases. Redeploy is for the government player to do. They can first move police to any economic centers or government-controlled spaces. Then they must move any troops on ECs or in provinces that don't have bases to government-controlled spaces that are either cities or provinces that have bases. Once that's done, they can shift troops around on the map between government-controlled spaces or bases. Basically, by the end of that maneuvering, there should only be police in economic centers or government-controlled spaces, and troops only in government-controlled spaces that have bases or are cities. And finally, the reset phase. All factions become eligible, regardless of where they were on the last event card played before the prop card. Remove any terror or sabotage markers still on the map. Government player discards the momentum cards. All guerrillas are flipped to underground, and all casinos are open. Discard that propaganda card, keeping it aside so you know how many have come up so far. Then draw the next card, which becomes the active event, and reveal the next card on top of the deck to see what's coming up. Proceed with play. Thus, the game can only end on a propaganda card, and it officially ends if and when that fourth and final propaganda card comes up. And a note on the final propaganda card, when it comes up, any players that are still eligible on the card before it may only perform a limited operation if they're performing any operations at all. If they're triggering the final event, they execute that fully. But if they're stuck with lim op and have a cash token available, they can execute one more operation if they cash that in. When victory checks happen, check everyone's victory conditions. If one player meets that condition, they're the winner. If multiple players meet the condition, whoever most exceeds theirs wins. If no one reaches their victory condition, then whoever is closest to theirs on the track wins at the end of the game. If there's a tie, first that goes to non-players, if you're using the non-player flowcharts, then to Syndicate, then to Directorial, then to July 26th. And that, folks, is how you play Cuba Libre. The flow's pretty straightforward. You reveal an event card, and up to 2 factions are going to be able to take some activities, either by doing their operations and potentially special activities, or triggering the event. And then you just keep refreshing cards until you get to the propaganda round, which is probably the hardest to wrap your head around the first few plays. But just as long as you know what your faction is aiming for when propaganda comes around, so that you can maximize on gaining resources and taking an extra action or two, just focus on that. Make sure you're in a good position when you think that card's going to be coming up. If this is your first time playing Cuba Libre, you might want to play as either the July 26th movement or the Directorio. Those are both very similar. Syndicate is a lot of fun, but might take a few plays for you to really understand what their path to victory is. Government is by far the hardest. So if you are the one teaching other people how to play, and they're playing for the first time, you're probably going to be the one sitting in as government, because there's a lot going on there, and they're all going to be at your throats for the first little while. I kind of like to think of it as the coin master role. It's a great seat to be in if you're teaching and helping people get accustomed to this game. This revolution was very pivotal in the 20th century, laying the groundwork for other events that gripped the world years later, mainly the Cuban Missile Crisis. Depending on your view, it was either a necessary step for this island nation, or yet another tyrant was swept into power, or the ripple effects of it further destabilized democracy in the Western world. Regardless, Cuba in the early 50s was a powder keg waiting to blow. Thanks in no small part to outside meddlers, mainly the US, and mostly the Mafia, which is why I chose to focus on the Syndicate mastermind himself, Meyer Lansky, in this installment of This Piece Changes History. Meyer Lansky was born in what is now Belarus to Polish Jewish parents. At a young age, he and his family, looking to escape the anti-Semitism in what was the Russian Empire at the time, immigrated to the United States and took up residence in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Growing up poor and in a rough neighborhood, he had many encounters with gangs and organized crime. One such encounter was with a man by the name of Charles Lucky Luciano. When Lucky tried to shake the younger Lansky down, he was met with fierce resistance, which Lucky admired and became friends with Lansky. By this point, Lansky was already involved with other mobsters and was bootlegging during the Prohibition era. Although Lansky wasn't Italian, his smarts and financial know-how earned him a spot at the table as the mafia's presence grew. In 1936, when Luciano got busted for running a prostitution ring, Lansky made a deal with the feds to help bust up Nazi gangs in the ports of Manhattan, where the mafia had a strong presence. Thus, Luciano was released, but on the condition he be deported to Italy. Now, Luciano eventually found his way from Europe to Cuba, where he met up with Lansky, who by now was making inroads to the gambling business on the island. Together, the two called on prominent gangsters from the U.S. to meet up in Havana, where agreements were laid out that would cement the mafia's presence in Cuba for the next decade. Eventually, Luciano got busted again and chased back to Italy, but Meyer Lansky kept things running in Cuba. Although only meeting with Batista briefly on a few occasions, the military leader was firmly in Lansky's back pocket. As long as money flowed in the right direction, the Cuban government would let the casino cash flow and even use their own troops and police to protect casinos from undesirable interference. Try as he might to keep Batista in power, when Fidel marched into Havana in January 1959, it was lights out for Lansky's casino operations in Cuba. He still had his Vegas operations to keep him going, along with many other real estate dealings in the U.S., but when the casino business in Cuba was nationalized in October 1960, it was estimated that Lansky lost $7 million US in assets, which in today's dollars would be nearly $50 million. Although he had his run-ins with the law and even briefly served time during the heyday of Cuban gambling, Lansky always kept a low profile and didn't attract nearly as much attention as Luciano and others within the mafia. This Jewish-American linchpin of the U.S.-Italian mob would amass a personal fortune and live to a ripe old age of 80. He died of lung cancer in 1983 in Miami Beach, Florida. You know, it's pretty wild to think that at one point Cuba was effectively being run by two men that had risen from poverty, both Batista and Lansky, just to have it ripped away by a socialist who actually grew up wealthier than them. So, for what it's worth, though, even though this is a game about the Cuban Revolution, you can't deny the impact that the U.S. mob had on the country. No gambling empire means less support and funding for the Batista government. Potentially fair and democratic elections could have taken place over the years, and the fuel would have been taken out of Castro's fire, or really out of any revolutionary's fire for that matter. When I reached out to the designers to ask, who or what should I highlight in This Piece Changes History, Jeff Grossman said E.T. Smith, who was the U.S. ambassador to Cuba at the time. Volko Ruhnke said Echeverria, who was the leader of the Directorio at the time before he was assassinated. Both those figures could have made a bigger impact on what happened in Cuba in the 50s. Smith could have gotten the CIA involved before it all hit the fan. Echeverria may have been a more inspiring leader before he was killed by police in 1957. I meant for this segment to talk about characters that did influence the course of history. So it was interesting to get their interpretation. Just, I call the piece, This Piece Changes History. On that alone, they assumed that to mean like, hey, this could have changed the historical outcome. So that's what I really like about coin games and card-driven games in general. They really do alter the timeline, giving you these events as cards. I used to think, doesn't it make sense to seed certain cards in the events deck, like, say, Batista flees, because that happened towards the end of the revolution. Shouldn't that come later in the events deck? But actually, that's kind of the point. The events are really opportunities where you got to be in the right place, the right time, the right board state for your faction and really take advantage of it, right? So even the act of Batista fleeing from Cuba itself was kind of premature in history. Like, he left when there wasn't that much of a credible threat from the Castro and his guerrillas. Castro is really good at, making his numbers look bigger than they were. So really, Batista could have stuck around and things could have been quite a bit different. So there's lots of great books and documentaries out there if you want to learn more about the Cuban Revolution. The designers themselves cite Inside the Cuban Revolution by Julia Swig is a great insight to the insurgent side of the story. There's also many published books by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara themselves. And I actually found the Netflix series of the same name, Cuba Libre, to be very informative, very kind of high level overview of the events that led up to and transpired during the Cuban Revolution. So definitely check that out if you get the time. And right now I am enjoying TJ English's Havana Nocturne. It's how the mob owned Cuba and then lost it all to the revolution. Really interesting. This is where I got a lot of the insight about Meyer Lansky. And for the record, that Lansky movie on Netflix, I didn't quite like it as much. I didn't think it was that great. Just not enough Cuba in it for my liking. Cuba holds a special place in my heart. You know, of the 3 games that I've covered so far, this is the first one about a place that I've actually been to. I've had the pleasure to visit. As a Canadian, I'm able to travel there as a tourist. So yeah, I've spent time on resorts and there over my adult life. Never been to a casino though. They're still running today. I've been fortunate enough, though, to also visit and spend time with some of the locals on their land, been invited out to farms for pig roasts and amazing meals. I was able to bike over 40 kilometers through the countryside to get there. Really amazing experience if you ever get to do something like that. The country is beautiful. The people I've met are warm, welcoming, and resilient. I wish they didn't have to be so resilient. I wish I didn't have to use that word. Is on average they live with much less amenities and comforts that we do in other parts of the developed world. So whether you agree with Castro's methods and his ruling overall, or even the need for him starting such a revolution, the fact remains that most of the developed world has heavily embargoed Cuba for decades now, namely the US. And that hasn't really helped the standard of living there for the people. But they do have one of the best life expectancies in all of Latin American countries, which is even better than the US right now, from what I hear. They've got a stellar healthcare system. Traditionally, under the Castro regime, they did not have a great human rights record, especially around LGBTQA plus rights. But that has recently changed with the Family Code of 2022. It's given a lot of rights back to all walks of life throughout Cuba, and this was voted on by the people. So you're starting to see some democracy in action. And well, the music, the food, the rum, love it all, right? So I like to imagine a world where Cuba is embraced more by the international community with more access to trade, more so than it is right now, because I cannot but think it would only help their citizens overall. So I hope you found this enjoyable, informative, not just to learn the game, but to learn a little bit about the history. If you get a chance to play, sound off in the comments. Let me know what you think of the game. Let me know what other coin games that you might want to be interested in exploring. Maybe there might be a video in the future for those as well. There's a lot more titles to cover and more coming along the way. And I've got more videos coming, so please do like and subscribe because I wouldn't want you to miss a thing. But that's all for now. Have a great time with this game. I hope to see you at the table one day. Adios.